All right, our next presenter is Jeff Howarth. He's going to be talking to us about the first of two talks in this session, to wrap things up about GIS&T Body of Knowledge and how cartographic education relates to that.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, so Rob Roth asked if I would write this cartography and education section for the Body of Knowledge. Okay, is that all right? Yeah. So I was asked to write this section on cartography and education. You can see that it's italicized, so as a cartographer, I know that means it's fluid and kind of undefined and natural. And if you click on it, it doesn't go anywhere. So I felt kind of free reign here I'm under the history and trends section, and I'll be honest, I don't really want to be under history because I don't really want to write the history of cartography and education. I'd rather actually be kind of down in this section because I think what we do as teachers is not really that different than what students do as cartographers. And you can't see where I'm going, but this section I'm pointing to is the part that's not on the screen. So anyway, I'll go back to this one. So these are a couple of recycled slides, just as background from 2010, the first NACIS I went to. I was asked to teach a cartography class. I never took a class in cartography. So my first move was to kind of see how other people had taught it. I liked Royce a lot. At the time, I was interested that he wrote a textbook. I went and looked at it. He actually had two, so I bought both of them. And when I read the intro to the revision, to the principles, I was kind of struck by this, that just 20 years ago he was trying to kind of summarize the whole field and kind of be an expert, and the most logical organization of subject matter is of little use if the interest of the student is not aroused and if she cannot understand the subjects and apply it to her purposes. I didn't get all the editing in there, so that's anyway. The point being that a lot of times being an expert is your biggest weakness to being a teacher, and the hardest thing to teaching is kind of remembering what it's like to know nothing. So what I'd like to try to do, and what I wanted to try to do with the body of knowledge, was to lay out some practical advice for teachers, less about the content that we should be teaching and more about like strategies for how you present it. And I think there's kind of two ways of doing this. You can talk about these kind of principles that are based on a theory of how people learn, or based on theories of how people learn, or you can think about these examples that you might have from experience and the kind of the practical knowledge that you have as a teacher, something that worked that you want to share. And one is a kind of a hypothesis kind of driven teaching where like this should work because the theory says it should, and so you're kind of testing that theory in a way. And I find that really helpful if you don't have a mentor. If you're tenure track, if you're assistant professor, you don't get mulligans, too many of them anyway, as an assistant professor when you're teaching. So if you don't have someone around who can help you, I spent a lot of time kind of just convening with ghosts and not so much like learning from people that are actually there. The other side is to kind of find something that works or do something that works and then reflect on why did that work. What are the reasons why that worked, and what's the kind of general class here of teaching that I just kind of tapped into. So I want to briefly talk about some principles today. This is kind of what I was like, I promised. I said, Rob, yes, I can get you an outline in May, and then Gene will have the final draft ready for you. And a couple of weeks ago, he kindly wrote to me and asked where was the outline. So I said, well, I'm on the program. Here's my outline. So I want to briefly kind of hit this. Can any of you read that in the back? Because I do the pop-up. But basic ideas, I'm trying to arrange these principles around questions. So questions you might ask when you're planning a course, trying to put it together. Questions that you might ask in terms of how you actually present content, whether it be in a lecture or in a lab. Questions that you might ask in terms of how do you get kids to practice and actually kind of apply the kind of ideas, and then questions that you might ask in terms of how you're going to provide feedback to students. And the idea is that each kind of question is really kind of pointing towards a principle that comes largely from cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and kind of these evidence-based bodies of knowledge largely from cognitive science. So just as an example, if you have the question, and this was a little bit kind of, I just picked this one because I think I spent a little bit more time listening to Bruce Springsteen than hearing what Ken was talking about the other day. And it's the idea of the kind of coherence principle. And I can just try to click on this to see if it pops up, but it's going to pop up on, so do you go there? So the idea is if the goal is to help your students learn something new, then you should try to eliminate interesting but irrelevant statements or graphics from your presentation. These extra tidbits require learners to process extra information. They're adding load to working memory. Can actually make it harder for people to learn. Here are the papers if you want to really read up more on it. I was thinking that, so what I'm imagining writing is just fairly like little tidbits like this in terms of these are reasons why this strategy tends to work. Both so that you can bring it into your own teaching, but also if you want to kind of bring your teaching into more of a research framework, you can start testing these ideas. So now I have to figure out how to get that out. All right. So what I want to do, what might be more interesting, is just to talk about some examples. So I was going to run through some examples that I use in teaching at Middlebury that kind of I've been working on for a few years, and a lot of them are just, there's kind of reasons why I do these things. So the first one is grouping tasks. I do a lot of these. Here's just an example of it. So this is the very first thing that I give students in cartography. I give them the handout. I tend to make things 8.5, 11 that you cut in half, so I can do little handouts, and at the end of the class they have a little book. Please organize these letters into groups and pair up and try to make groups out of these letters. And people tend to look at me like, and I was like, yeah, you thought cartography was cool. It's like, it's gonna be the nerdiest thing you do. But they buy into it and they get into it and they make groups. And then we say, okay, what are the groups that you guys made? And they defend their groups, and often they get kind of passionate about why one group's better than another. But the idea is that it's pre-training. I'm just trying to get them to kind of look before I tell them anything. It's active because they're doing something. They're not just being told. There's coherence in the sense that it's a real simple problem. There's nothing else to really distract them. It's self-reflection because they have to argue and they have to kind of explain why they're making these decisions. It's collaborative because they're working together, so they have to find points of agreement. It's somewhat personalized because I said please, you know, but and the idea that it's like I'm trying to make this social. So, and that's kind of a setup. So then I think you can go to something like this and even give this to them as they start talking about defending their groups, because now they're going to use these terms to kind of, and recognize that, oh, that's why I put these two groups together. So it's kind of pre-training before you jump into something like this, which I think if you hand something like this to someone who doesn't know anything about type before, like it's not going to sink in. So principled judgments, I like teaching Imhoff's classic paper. I like assigning it as reading. It was for a while a really hard thing for me to figure out how to build a discussion around it. So what I discovered is if I just take off his labels of what's good and bad, then I can ask the students to tell me which one is better and why. So I give them this handout. I organize it by kind of class, and they don't have any of the labels in terms of what Imhoff thinks, and they have to then, in small groups, first tell me which one is, decide which one is the correct way of doing it, but also articulate why and kind of connect back to his 6 or 7 principles that he starts with at the beginning of that paper. So I think you could do this with a lot of the stuff that's in the body of knowledge. So here's Alex Tate's thing on visual hierarchy. Simple thing, you take off the labels, you rearrange it a little bit, and now it's all of a sudden an active problem. They're basically little quizzes. If you ask the group now, okay, tell me which one of these do you think is his best example and why? And what are the problems with the other one? So just a way to, rather than just kind of lecture, to kind of get the students to actually do something and to kind of engage with it. So analog digital, I find additive color is a tricky thing for students to learn how to do. I really wish it was just called BGR. And so here's my attempt at teaching BGR. And I give them a little image and I say, okay, draw the lines. How are these lines here what's the line to give me black? What's the line to give me white? And if they do that, okay, now let's go to these other colors. Like how do you give me red? How do you give me green? How do you give me blue? How do you give me a lighter version of these things? And they just draw the lines up on those bars. Then let's go to the tricky ones. So can you draw the lines to give me those? Okay, now let's talk about this. Since you're now primed to think about how these graphs are representing these values of blue, green, and red, and now we can start to look at this and begin to interpret it. So just kind of starting simple, starting with an activity that they have to draw, and it's helpful. Video tutorials, I make them, I've been making them for a long time. A lot of other people make them, and there are some issues with them. You need to have a site map. A lot of times students don't feel like kind of stuck in a canyon when they're in a video because they don't know where it's going or like how to jump around in it. But in general, in the principles of multimedia learning, it's really nice to not force people to read text, because you can listen to text and it frees up working memory if you listen to words while you look at images. So it's a nice technique and it's very easy to do and to host. Thank you. Style guide was just mentioned, so I'll just breeze over it, but another kind of like start simple and move more complex. You know, first couple weeks we don't even make a map in cartography. We just focus on developing a style guide. Each student makes their own, gives them a chance to experiment, to see how things look like in print, so they can kind of put it on the wall and stand away from it, move up towards it. You can play with different colors, so find a map you like the palette, tell me how the palette breaks down in CMYK. Talk about different ways of doing ramps, but it's all done kind of in a simple world without the complexity of without the messiness of geography. Monochrome lighting, so this is just, this is a bad graphic I made in 2010 with the premise of it's hard to teach in color, so maybe the first step is to try to move towards teaching in black and white. Daniel gave a great talk the other day about kind of like teaching in monochrome as a kind of a challenge, but I'd say it's actually like a really nice part of a sequence of learning how to do cartography. At the very least, start with just a grayscale base map, but like wait a while till you bring in the color. There's a lot of reasons to kind of do this, that it'll likely work and be successful. Learning from good examples. So this is kind of picture from an art museum. You see this a lot. Art museums are going to have these easels where people can kind of recreate. What I've found is that if you do this kind of I do a lot of pop-up crits, so we just kind of like tape up maps on the wall and we kind of move around. The students are going to need a fair amount of structure to do this because they haven't really developed the kind of framework to kind of critique yet. The alternative approach, this is something I did a number of years ago. Tim Wallace had a map in the New York Times, so I was like, okay, let's just try to recreate this map. So I did a ARC tutorial on kind of doing a simplified version of that map, but basically each time looking at the decisions that he made or the cartographers made, and then trying to kind of emulate it. This is another more recent attempt at this. This is Will Green's. He's from this island. He's a student right now at Middlebury, and his challenge was, can I update that map with current data and use a computer to do it? And he learned a lot from this. Just by trying to replicate it and realizing the kind of the limits of digital compared to hand-drawn, and vice versa. The map crits, so we've talked about these. You let people critique. I tend to have to teach people how to critique, start with something nice, don't tell them what they should change, tell them what's not working for you, just a little bit of a framework to help them actually give constructive advice. She has that kind of slump shoulder look of the way we all feel when you've just gone through a critique. But the other key thing was to not just have students critique each other in cartography, but have to show it to people who know nothing about maps. So we took advantage of a student symposium to be able to get students from outside of geography and cartography to give feedback, which is kind of a helpful move. And then reflections on the design process. So I took the idea of the Pechakucha from NACIS and cut it in half. And so I said, okay, you have 10 slides, 30 seconds per slide. Walk me through your design process, like how you made this map. So this was Sarah Howard's. She started by looking, and then she looked at good examples, and she looked at more examples, and then she started working on the terrain, and then she got the land cover, and then she looked at a printout, and then she got the place names, and then she compared two printers, and then she was done. right? And but it's a very nice way to kind of be able to like be aware of what are they thinking as they make this, or at least like reflecting on the process of making it, and not just being stuck with having to evaluate the product as like the only thing that you assess. So the goals moving forward, I'm writing the article I think is largely about kind of trying to just describe the principles if people are interested in those, and how they potentially illustrating them by a few. But the larger, I think, more productive space would be whether it's a web space or whether, if folks are interested, we try to do some kind of a panel at the AAG where we actually kind of try to teach each other things, with not so much the emphasis being like that we need to learn typography or something, but just the ways that we're using to teach, and like to get people to actually reflect and share the kind of the methods that they're using. But all of this is, I think, more of a community like this. I don't want to be I'm not the only one doing it. We just kind of different ways of figuring out how to share it. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Plenty of time for questions for Jeff.
Hi.
Are you teaching on a semester?
We have a 12-week semester, so it's almost like it should be a quarter system, but it's a semester load and a quarter time frame is Middlebury's mode. So yeah, so 12 weeks. So usually 3 hours of contact in lecture and 3 hours in lab a week. Yep.
When you're, I thought the style guide sort of assignment that you offered was really interesting. When you were offering that or assigning that to your students, how much guidance do you provide in that assignment?
So a fair amount. I think that providing structures and constraints for a lot of this is really important. Like one of the principles being the guided discovery. So I think students need help learning how to set problems. So the cartography guide was simple things like, I want this to be practical for you, but also some specific assignments. Like for the CMYK palette mixing was like, the assignment was that you have to find a map that you like and then be able to describe its palette in like 5 colors or less, and then tell me the CMYK for it. So some pretty specific constraints too. But I think that the key is to constrain it enough where you still get everyone doing something different, but they're kind of all, but no one gets lost. So, yep.
How long have you been teaching, and as you, like from when you started, like what was your progression as improving as a professor?
No power, like I don't use PowerPoint. I don't, everything is handouts now. I don't lecture anymore. I don't assign textbooks. So I think I've been more and more just kind of comfortable with the content and not needing so many crutches myself, even though I still totally blow on, I'm not a great cartographer at all, but I think that like there's a lot of just kind of engaging more with students. Sorry, that didn't hit it.
Do you have computers in the room where you're teaching?
For lectures, no. The lectures are pretty analog. The labs, yes, they have the stations. Yep.
I think you said this at the start, but what courses have the students had before coming into this?
So in the past, I've Intro to GIS as a prerequisite. This year I'm actually teaching CART without a prerequisite, and partly it's because the GIS program at Middlebury is starting to splinter. We no longer teach ARC as the intro. There's someone teaching Q, and then I'm teaching Google Earth Engine for kind of raster-based kind of GIS. So it's starting to be kind of so splintered in terms of the expertise that students are going to come into the classroom with, that I just figured I'd start from scratch. And it's, for me, an interesting constraint of not having students have to find the data, but more kind of providing data sets and then seeing what kind of diversity you can get from like the similar starting point.
Yeah, follow-up. So what software do you expect them, do you teach them to use?
I teach almost everything now, and it's, I do the classic kind of ARC to Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign kind of workflow. Yep.
One last question while Chelsea gets set up.
Sure, sorry.
So what do you think about sort of a classic sort of topic-focused process where like this week we focus on type, this week we focus on color, whatever, versus sort of a more holistic, we're working toward this grand design at the end, and we're just kind of around the HOA and thoughts one way or the other?
So I don't think that design works taxonomically. So I think that a lot of times you have taxonomic organization because it's the way the experts curate their vast expertise. So I like little kind of tiny pieces. I think it's fine to like have a week on type, just because there's kind of a lot to cover just on simple topics like that. But I try to pretty quickly, like by the fourth week or so, start to kind of having to bring things together, because it's the messiness is when principles conflict, and like how do you make, you always have to break things when you make a map. So that's kind of where the fun part comes in.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.